Hello, everyone. Welcome to the In the Lab podcast with Luminate. My name is Rob Steiner. I'm a media analyst with Luminate Intelligence, and today I am joined by Andy Chatterley. He is the CEO and co-founder of MUSO, which is dedicated to tracking piracy activity within the entertainment industry. Andy, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here, Rob. Thank you for inviting me to join you.
Starting with a general overview, what is MUSO in a nutshell? Why did you start the company, and why piracy data in particular?
It's a great question. It's been a 15-year journey since we started the company. So initially, prior to starting MUSO, I worked as a record producer and a songwriter in the music industry for my entire career, actually. And my wife's album, she's also a commercial artist in the UK, her third album leaked to piracy about 10 days before we were releasing. And we were going for a relatively high chart position on that record, or we were aiming for a high chart position. And we had this piracy leak, and I sort of turned to the music industry, trade bodies, try and find some external vendors or anybody who could help us deal with the problem. And I just couldn't find anything. And it became incredibly frustrating, being part of the releasing team, working with the record company and knowing that we were losing sales, or presuming that we were losing sales to piracy. So along with my co-founders, we built a system that tracked known piracy websites at the time and used metadata to search for content, and then facilitated the removal of that content via a DMCA notice. 6 or 7 years into that journey of protecting content, we moved beyond music. So we started working with TV companies, lots of film companies, publishing companies, software and gaming companies, protecting their content. But we realized we were sitting on a mountain of data. We had been tracking the entire piracy ecosystem whilst protecting it on behalf of rights holders. And so we started to build out what we now call MUSO Discover, which is our data analytics platform. And we do a few different things. So we track piracy activity in a few different ways. One is from a media sector view. So we call this piracy by industry. And this is where we track visits to known or to our database of piracy domains in every country in the world, 192 countries and regions, for TV, film, music, software, and publishing. So this data tends to be used by governments, IPO offices around the world, people who are dealing with site blocking, compliance, these kinds of things. And then probably the more interesting data set for this conversation is what we now call audience demand. And this is a really interesting point. It was initially called piracy by title. We track currently daily consumption on 870,000 film and TV titles in 192 countries and regions around the world. So initially we sold that to anti-piracy teams, and we still do, and they use that to sort of understand how effective their solutions are when they're investing into piracy activity, measuring effectiveness and ROI and things like that. But what became really interesting for us was that it's a very, very true signal of demand. So what I mean by that, especially for film and TV, is because piracy has no barriers to entry, because there's no pricing barrier, and because there's no licensing restrictions, pretty much within an hour, and often before it's available on a video streaming on demand platform, it's on a whole plethora of piracy websites. And what that gives us is a signal of demand in Lithuania, in Colombia, in France, in every country in the world, because it's very, very widespread. And so now our data, whilst also being used by piracy teams, is also being used by sales agents, acquisition teams, streaming platforms looking to buy content or program content, because it's giving them a signal of demand that they're not able to see in other data sets. We kind of describe it as, what you get from traditional audience measurement is everything above the iceberg, but what we're showing you is everything below the surface.
So then getting into the audience data, MUSO does a great job tracking across multiple entertainment fields, TV, film, music, even publishing and software. And from the chart you sent me tracking from around mid-2024 to May 2025, it is interesting to see that, one, TV is easily the highest demand for unlicensed visits. That is interesting, where I do feel like the poster child for online piracy tends to be movies. That's what people usually think of. And two, it is going down, even though TV piracy audience demand is still high across the board as well. It does seem like site visits are decreasing. And, you sent me a chart a while back that zoomed out to like 2017, and there was a pretty stark decline there. So why do you think that is the case?
I don't think we're seeing it across the board. I think it depends which particular sector you look at, and also it's quite seasonal. So, for TV and film piracy, well, if we look at TV first, I think year on year, so across that period you mentioned earlier, June 24 to May 25, I think we saw a 4.15% decline. But what we always see is, as bigger flagship releases get released, often in Q4, you always see an increase at that point, especially around Christmas. And I think on the chart you're referring to, you can see that pick up into the Christmas months, and then it comes down. So there is a seasonal dip. So it would sort of depend on which particular period you're looking at for those kinds of things. I think that the other form of piracy where we've seen really large increases is on publishing piracy. Publishing piracy year on year is up just under 11%, I think 10.8%. It's never a straight line. It's never a straight line. I think where we can certainly say that we've seen big decreases over the years is in music piracy, because, unlike film and TV, or especially TV, music have made everything available on all the platforms. So if you're an Apple Music subscriber or a Deezer or a Spotify subscriber, you can still, or Tidal, you can still access everything on those platforms. And I think in terms of the battle against piracy, that was a really, really smart move. Whereas with film and TV, obviously it's much more fragmented and behind individual paywalls broadly. Right.
Yeah, and for sure, the streaming landscape regarding film and TV is vastly different than music. On multiple ways, on top of price points being cheaper for music streaming platforms than, say, the Netflixes and Disney Pluses of the world. The past few years, there's been a lot of criticism within the industry around, one, price hikes, also the sheer increasing number of these streaming platforms, which has then sort of led to the rebirth of the bundle, the dreaded bundle deal. So how have all of these things within the streaming landscape on the license side, how has that impacted the unlicensed side from what you've seen?
I mean, we've definitely over the period of time where we started to see that happening, we've definitely seen increases in consumption, increases in piracy for film and TV, but more for TV. And we have seen some decline for film, but I can come into that separately. I mean, I think years ago, I wrote something for Forbes around 2019 and just called out subscription fatigue. I was predicting that we would see subscription fatigue happening with the fragmentation and the behind the paywalls. But I can't really, I don't know enough about the business models of all of the companies, and I'm sure they're doing just great, But in terms of piracy impact, yeah, it has had an impact. In a converse way to music, where music we've seen this continual trend down, with other media forms we've seen it going upwards. But I think the other thing that's very interesting is what kind of content is being consumed. Perhaps we'll come on to that, but when you look for publishing, the cultural increase driven by manga, and for TV driven by anime globally with US audiences as well, then I think demand is perhaps somewhat bigger than just the fragmentation of the platforms.
Right. Getting into, what exactly people are pirating. You mentioned anime from the list you sent me. It also seems like a lot of platform exclusive content, like Squid Game, The Last of Us, but also several anime shows that are maybe only available via Netflix in the US. That seems to have had become a pretty key driver in unlicensed demand.
Definitely, 100%. I mean, if we focus on anime for a second, in the US over the last 12 months, I think bear in mind we're tracking 870,000 titles.
Right.
That includes episodes, but titles nevertheless. The top 10 in the US were all anime or animation. In fact, we've seen the share of our anime content in our data set growing from, I think in 2020 it was 9% of our demand, and in 2024 it accounted for 22% of demand. So huge increases. But also, what I find quite interesting is when you sort of look at a platform like Crunchyroll that are anime exclusive almost, it's their subscriber number growth with US audiences has been incredibly successful, and it's very similar. The amount of subscriber growth they've had to the amount of demand that we see in anime, they're sort of at a similar level in terms of percentage growth. And I think what's quite interesting for us is we saw the demand in anime over-indexing from any other data set back in 2019, and for Korean TV dramas as well. Things like Hotel Beauty, I think, was like number 2 in America in the first month we launched. And, no one knew about that title, I think, at that point. So I think the interesting thing with the data that we see is it's this bellwether, this trend predictor of what's coming and what's moving forward, because often the content that people are looking for, as you said, is available exclusively on a platform or is not available at all in that region. So yeah, I think exclusivity plays a part of demand for piracy. But, on the other side, I'm sure it's incredibly valuable for the platforms if you have exclusivity, because it's what people want to watch. It's more, the way I sort of view this data is more like showing you what's happening and showing you what's coming in terms of demand. So helping you make better decisions for buying content and knowing what people actually want to watch.
Yeah, and it is interesting looking at these trends where, despite anime piracy being so high, Crunchyroll is still steadily bringing in huge subscriber counts, despite Squid Game being one of the most pirated non-anime shows. Netflix is still thriving, right? So do you think these trends sort of might challenge older industry ways of thinking about piracy?
It used to be the narrative, that used to be the rhetoric that we'd hear. I think it's very different now. Without going into our customer list, our customers are using this data to buy titles, and they're using this data to make acquisition, commissioning decisions. They're using it, production companies, sales agents are using it to increase the value of the content that they're selling, because it's not about, oh, look, it's been pirated, therefore you've missed the opportunity. It's more about there's demand here within this unlicensed community, let's call it. And if you can license it and make it available, there's a big opportunity to make revenue from that business decision. And so, yeah, I do think there's a changing of the guard. Like a couple of years ago, when we were having these conversations with people, depending on the company, like this, this is not a sweeping statement. I mean, it is, again, nuanced, but people would often be like, look, I've been in the business for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. I go to events, I buy and sell content. Why do I need data? And now, for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's post the strikes or, people are looking at doing things in different ways. We're getting completely the opposite. The piracy thing is just not, unless we're selling to piracy teams, it's not a concern for them. It's just about understanding an audience that previously they weren't able to measure. And I think that is quite a seismic shift in the way that our customers are using it, because they're not buying our data because it looks nice and it's telling them a number. They're buying it because there's a real business return on an ROI for them. They're making better business decisions. They're making more money by having additional data that sort of shows them what to buy, or at least helps them directionally understanding what they should be buying, commissioning, or programming.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that also ties into what's going on in publishing that you briefly mentioned before. It's a subject that I myself have covered in the past as well. And yeah, so just why manga? Not only is it just driving this explosive, almost single-handedly driving this explosive growth in publishing, it's not just in one location. Yes, the U.S. is the primary driver behind it, but it's a global thing, right?
Well, I mean, interestingly, of our data, America accounts for about 10% of the global traffic. So, that's huge. I mean, I've got a 14-year-old, and he's obsessed with manga and anime, and various people who work at MUSO and various friends, their kids are obsessed with manga. It's a cultural phenomena, and it's not as easy to access it. It's not as easy to get translations. There's tons of these, reading sites, translated sites, easier ways to access it. It is just one of these things, and we see it in the TV, on the anime data in TV, and we see it in the huge growth of manga. But we're seeing it culturally. We see it in fashion, and we see it in sort of trends amongst younger people. So it doesn't surprise me at all, on a global basis, why there's so much demand for it. But again, it comes down to access. It comes down to one of access. I mean, we work with a lot of Japanese publishers protecting content and dealing with takedowns and things on sites, and the numbers are extraordinary. I mean, they are staggering. The numbers of takedowns and things like that happen. So, yeah, I just think it's a cultural thing, and it's not new. I was speaking to someone at MUSO, and they're a big fan of manga and anime, but they've been watching it since the late 80s. I think it's just been a continuation and a growth of an art form, a creative art form. And because of the nature of, there's a lot of it, for one, and accessing it in Western territories, the digital means of accessing it via unlicensed websites is very, very easy, unfortunately, for people to do.
As someone who covers the music industry, I did find it interesting that it is currently one of the lowest fields in terms of unlicensed audience demand. Yet at the same time, there's no questioning that digital piracy, had a pretty profound impact on the music industry that we are still seeing today. I talk to industry types, and they still shudder at the mere mention of Napster, So from someone who has worked in the music industry, what was that whole era like from your perspective, this rise of digital piracy?
It's a great question. There's a few things I'd love to cover off on that point. I'll start with going back to the day when Napster came out. I think the music industry was the canary in the coal mine, as it often is actually, and it hit it so fast. Because an MP3 is a relatively small file, it nevertheless on LimeWire it still took 7 days to download a song, but it was a huge explosion, and it was very, very difficult for the industry to sort of react in a way to protect its revenues, because they weren't only dealing with MP3, Napster, LimeWire, and Kazaa, and these kinds of sites. They were also dealing with the whole digital transformation, and it made a huge change to the business model, to their cost centers, and I think, my opinion, did the music industry do it badly? I mean, it's with hindsight, you could have said, like, you could have licensed Napster, and you could have been 8 years ahead of Spotify. But I don't think, unless you were sitting there in the rooms, with the various people that are negotiating it and trying to make the best decision for the industry, I think it's too easy to say that. Who knows what information they had, what kind of existential threat it was posing at the time in those rooms for the people that were running the industry. I think it would have been incredibly difficult, to do it, and it was incredibly painful, because the business model was, the CD was very, very profitable. it was a great industry, I suppose, in the late 90s, early 2000s in terms of record sales and revenues. And it's taken us a long time to get back to similar revenues now that we had in 1999, from streaming. So yeah, piracy was hugely impactful, and the lessons that the music industry learned were very beneficial for the other industries, because it dealt with it and it had to deal with it. I think when Sir Lucian Grange said, we're not going to have any exclusives on platforms, I think that was probably the best thing that the music industry could have done for piracy, and absolute fair play to him or the organization Universal for doing that, because it really did make a huge difference. Coming back to what we see today, though, one small correction on music piracy. We're tracking visits to domains. It's not part of our audience demand product, because our audience demand product is really where we're tracking the consumption of film and TV. However, we track film and TV on unlicensed streaming websites and torrent downloads. Now, we do track music on torrent downloads, and this is where it gets quite interesting, because for TV, torrents make up 2 or 3% of consumption when you're looking at it by visits to networks. When we look on an individual title, it depends on the title. Most people will stream a TV show. Very few people will download them via torrents. For film, it's maybe 20%, 25% torrents and the rest streaming. So people still want to download often, a larger movie that they can watch uninterrupted. For music, though, when we see torrents, we're seeing quite significant consumption and what looks to be growing consumption of music via the torrent network. The difference is it's not people streaming like the latest Kendrick song. They're not streaming a song, they're downloading albums and they're downloading collections. So we'll see, the entire Taylor Swift catalog being downloaded in one torrent bundle, or the Beatles collection, or every Rolling Stones album made in the 70s. And catalog is really, really popular. It's very interesting what's happening there. Now, I don't think there's enough data or even any kind of validity in the data to sort of argue this point, because I think streaming's huge and incredibly successful for the music industry. But there is an argument to say that people are realizing what they stream again and again and again, and downloading it and owning it and having it on their computer. Now, I don't think necessarily we're going to see cancellation of streaming subscriptions, but I think it might sort of add to the plateauing of subscriber numbers at a certain point, when people can just go, well, I only actually listen to 10 artists, so I can download them and have them in HD quality on my laptop, and that's that, or they're streaming successfully, but they want to own these particular albums. I do think there's still quite a lot of money being left on the table, especially from big heritage artists who are not necessarily falling into the frontline protection for anti-piracy, but are having their catalogue, downloaded millions and millions and millions of times, and obviously losing a lot of revenue.
Yeah, and that plateauing of streaming services is sort of the current hot button issue of the industry. This year seems to be sort of setting the stage for a lot of the big players they're currently in the process of, setting up new income streams and essentially re-adding value to music that was lost in the piracy era. And I do think that's interesting when you look at this data and you see a pretty marked shift from looking at specific types of, or at least the specific methods of how people are going about music piracy. In 2017, one of the most popular methods was just going to unlicensed streaming platforms. Now, in 2024, it is overwhelmingly web download platforms and stream ripper platforms, like YouTube to MP3. To you, do you think that signals that there is, even though streaming is more popular than ever, do you think that this also sort of signals that there is a demand for ownership that perhaps the music industry is ignoring? Like, I don't know if that's too strong of a word.
It's a great question. No, it's still there. And, when you do look at the download side of things, it's significant, let's say, especially in terms of volume. It's a tricky one to answer. I think it depends on the nature of the label. So I think the independent labels are really aware of the issue, and perhaps they're, investing more in protecting their catalog and things like that from content protection. I think with the major labels, it's more about frontline, and it's more about protecting their bigger artists, and kind of the catalog will do its thing. And yeah, we can repackage it, and we can do the best of, and we can do it in the different vinyl, all these other ways that they're kind of monetizing their catalog. But broadly, it's the long tail game on streaming, and it's just printing money as part of their overall part of streaming royalties, and long may that continue for them. But I think probably, yeah, there probably is this kind of thing with the music industry where they're saying, well, we've kind of solved piracy because of streaming, so we don't need to think about it anymore. And then, round the back door comes this big thing on downloading via torrent sites, especially bundles of catalog and bundles of albums. That's probably being missed a little bit, falling through the gaps, let's say, in their approach.
So then, with that in mind, like, how do you think labels, distributors, publishers, essentially people who, are controlling these releases, how do you think they can take this information and act upon it?
Yeah, so if we put the lens to audience demand and via the torrent data that we've got, like we haven't, monetized that data, if you like. We haven't productized that data. Our product is very much focused on film and TV. But we have that data, and we do supply that data to various companies that are interested in sort of measuring consumption. I think everything that you said is correct. If you've got audience demand data and you understand what people are looking to get, then that will give you some help. If you're a record company, to go, oh, that's really interesting. I'm trying to think of an album. The Bee Gees is a huge in Indonesia or whatever, and we're seeing that massively in what's going on in downloads and torrent downloads. Then that gives you an opportunity to repackage, to remarket, to sort of push out to fans, because that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with fans, and they want to collect it, and they want to get limited edition Japanese versions or whatever it happens to be. So, yeah, I think much like our audience demand data for film and TV, it's a signal of what's in demand. And whether it's Billboard charts like the guys at Luminate do, or UK charts, it's just a demand of popularity. And if you can use that demand of popularity to make better decisions in how you market, how you push things out, how you monetize it, then it's incredibly helpful data for businesses.
So, just in short, at this point in time, do you think piracy will ever, quote unquote, go away? And two, like, if not, how do you think the industry, like the entertainment industry at large, should treat piracy?
It's a very interesting question, right? I think you have to, from my perspective, frame it through two different lenses. Like, doing everything we can to stop piracy is really critical. If you're protecting really valuable IP one way or another, so you need to employ, if you own that content, employ companies like MUSO, and there's plenty of other companies around that also do content protection, or your own internal teams. But what we see is you're never going to stop it entirely. And that's just the fact, because it's so, the tentacles of the piracy octopus are so vast, so, hidden and obfuscated. So no, I don't think we will stop piracy, but I think it's critical that we limit it, and we provide better alternatives for people, and we make sure that the pricing models are affordable in the various territories, and we open up access where we can. I think a lot of the times in all media industries, sometimes licensing appears a little bit arbitrary, or a bit of a strategy to drive more sales, or to please, partners on some end of the scale. And I think all of those kinds of restrictive things probably increase the levels of demand where people can't access it, and therefore piracy will increase. We have a whole department of piracy website classification because it moves so quickly and you have to keep up to date with it. It just never stops still. It changes what it's showing. It changes the nature. It changes the balance between, if it's just showing publishing and then suddenly it's showing publishing and film and then TV, it's a fast shifting landscape. Sites are compliant one day with takedowns, and then go dark and then they're not compliant. And it happens all the time. So it's a permanent sort of battle and game to get compliancy out of site. But why I find the MUSO journey really, really fascinating on a personal level, and this isn't a sales pitch, but it's the reason I started the company with the co-founders was because of the issue that we had around the album that we were releasing. And so, when we went into it, it felt very personal. It felt very like it was affecting me directly. And there was almost a sort of altruistic approach to the company. It's like we wanted to help people, and we still do, protect their content because we understand what it takes to make content, whether that's a book, a film, a TV show, a piece of music, an album. It's a creative endeavor that has huge, it takes an army of people often, or a big team of people, in a lot of cases to make these things. And they're huge investments at times from people. Piracy itself has been incredibly damaging when you think about the losses of jobs to the industry. Things like, recording studios, sound stages, productions going down, catering being cut, runners. The whole nature of the industry, it's caused absolute chaos and terrible financial loss, and still does. This is a big problem on one hand, and we have to approach it with every tool in our arsenal to kind of curb it, education, limit the distribution, site block. And data has a massively important part in that, to understand where to focus your intentions that's going to make the most impact. So that's our piracy by industry data. And that's where we sell that. On the other side of the coin, and coming back to why I find the MUSO story so interesting, is you get to a point, when you're protecting content where it's like, well, this is just going to go on forever. This is whack-a-mole. You do it for this one, the next one comes out, and you're in that situation. But with the audience demand data that we've got, we feel like it's the first time in 20 years of piracy being, a big concern for the creative industries, that you can actually use this data to make more money, to improve your chances of selling more, to increase the value of your content, because you're understanding what people are watching in absence of any other data that's showing this particular audience. And so I think there's a huge opportunity now from articulating that data and using it in the right way across businesses, where it's not stigmatized as, they're pirates, they're not valuable, or it's being dealt with by the team down the hall who are doing an incredible job, the anti-piracy teams at these companies. But where the data is becoming valuable is that it's showing what people actually want to watch. And that, because it's early, can spot these early trends, shape smarter licensing decisions, improve acquisitions, improve commissioning. And we are seeing that quite quickly now becoming, I wouldn't say it's industry standard, because we're definitely not at that point, but we're seeing our data being used. The adoption rates are really high, and people are using it actively, from talent agencies to platforms to distributors to producers to film financiers who are suddenly going, like, there's a light bulb moment we see often in that process where suddenly it's like, okay, we're protecting this, but we can also use this data to improve, the chances of success ultimately.
Andy, thank you again for joining me. This was a great conversation.
Awesome. Glad to speak with you, Rob. Great questions, and thank you for. And it's great speaking to you, because you we've spoken a couple of times previously, and I know you really get it, and it's good. It's good to have those conversations.